So I think we can kick off. Good evening if you're in Australia, and good morning if you're in Europe, and good afternoon if you're somewhere in between. Welcome to the third annual symposium that we've run on project leadership in a changing world. And it's run by the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership, of which I'm the director. And we're passionate about this because we know what a changing world we're moving into, and we think project leadership is important for addressing some of the big challenges that we face. So I want to start by acknowledging and recognising and paying respect to the elders and communities, past, present and emerging, of the lands on that the University of Sydney campuses stand on. For thousands of years, they've shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. And just to say a few words about the Institute before we kick off. So our mission is to improve project leadership in Australia and internationally, and I think those things are linked. Australia is a very large island, but it's also connected with the rest of the world, and we all face significant challenges in terms of project delivery. We are very focused on the fact that projects are future oriented, whether they're in infrastructure or response and recovery, designing and delivering new vaccines, adapting transportation, new forms of energy. And futures are also uncertain. So when we're thinking about projects, we're dealing with technological choices, social decisions, our relationship with the planet and with future generations. And at the University of Sydney, we're very keen that we have research-informed executive education and practice-informed research. So there's a flywheel between our activities in research and education. And we very recently had the 10-year celebration of John Grill's investment in our institute, and brought together our alumni, our industry partners and our key academics, because we're believing in this way of working where practice informs our research agendas and our research informs our education. So we have research-informed executive education, and we have practice-informed research. And for us, there are really three themes that we see as being particularly important around project leadership in a changing world. So one of those is around the digital transformation, and we're going to talk more about that in this session. One is around the organisational dynamics, and earlier in the year we ran a workshop, a mega project workshop, looking at the ways that the organisational structures around projects are changing, the kind of large programmes of projects that are now being delivered. And the third of those is around projects for sustainable, resilient and just futures. And in the first session of the symposium this year, which was run in the morning in Australia, connecting with the Americas, then we thought hard about the projects in the energy transition. We thought hard about resilience and the challenges that we face both in Australia and internationally as a result of that. I was in a webinar earlier on net zero in infrastructure. We're engaged in that kind of debate around how do we think about projects in this world where we need to think about the energy transition, sustainability, what kinds of projects do we deliver, how do project managers engage with these issues as they're delivering projects. And we've been thinking about that both in terms of the work that we've been doing on project leadership, the research agenda that we wrote around project leadership in a changing world, and also then thinking about projects as interventions into infrastructure systems. And we really encourage you to join us on this journey. And we have a call for papers out, and I'll say a little bit about that at the end of the 2 hours, because we would really encourage you to submit your papers, become part of this agenda around how do project leaders adapt to the new challenges that they face, the new external challenges that they face as they address they address the challenges of digitization, the increasing number of stakeholders that they have to face, and then these challenges around the mindset shift that's required to deliver in a sustainable, resilient, and just way. So I'm going to move us relatively quickly on. So just to give you an overview of the agenda. The first panel session is going to really get into that issue of digital. So we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence is changing project leadership. And I think all of us will have, at this point, had a play with some of the tools that are now becoming productized in this area, and had to think about how this is going to change our own practice. And so I have three leading experts in this area to come and discuss this with us. And I will introduce them at the start of that session. We then have a session of research presentations, and we have four academics, key experts from across the world, who will talk about a range of topics associated with project leadership. Eleni will talk about leading psychologically safe teams. We've got a talk on project delivery in the crypto commons, community stakeholder engagement, and then the transition to operations. And so we're really excited to be able to showcase some of the leading international research in this area. And then I will close, and I will just touch again on some of the opportunities for you to engage with us and to help push these agendas forward. And so I'm going to move us then straight into our first panel discussion. Oh, just one thing before I do that. So if you do use social media, if you're still on X and you're using LinkedIn, then we have a hashtag, and I'll just leave this up there for a second, because if you want to use your phone to capture that QR code, then that links to our LinkedIn, to our Twitter account, and to the other social media that we use to disseminate information on this symposium and other activities that we do. Please do feel free to join our newsletter and to engage with us through that. I think we will put this up again at the end if you don't manage to capture it now, but that's the hashtag for this event. So I'm going to move us into our first session, and welcome to the stage our three panelists, Stefan, Dijla, and Matt. And I suggest that that I hand over to you to introduce yourselves in that order. Stefan, if you could go first.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. So my name's Stefan Williams. I'm a professor of robotics at the University of Sydney, and also lead the Digital Sciences Initiative, which is an initiative bringing together research in digital sciences from across the university.
Hi, my name is Dijla Kortantamer. I'm a lecturer in project management at the University of Leeds. I specialize on project leadership, and my background is computer science and information systems.
And my name is Matt Geiselman, that's how you pronounce that. I'm with Bentley Systems. I work across the Asia-Pacific region on advancing infrastructure intelligence and looking at how we can deliver infrastructure in a more technologically effective means.
Great. And one thing I forgot to tell the participants is that, please do put your questions for our panelists into the Q&A, and you can thumb up and thumb down. Well, I think you can thumb up questions, and so as questions rise to the top, then I will use them. But I wanted to really start off Stefan, by asking you, you know, what's exciting? What are the exciting areas of data science and AI?
Well, I think, I mean, you hear a lot about it in the news, but things like large language models, generative AI, these sorts of tools, which are really starting to show ability to what looks like understand text, summarize data, bring that together in a way that really pulls together relationships in both language, in written text, but also extracting meaning from imagery. These are all really exciting tools that are being deployed across a broad range of different activities, from construction, supply chain logistics. We do a lot of work in mining automation, and increasingly all of those fields are really exploiting innovation in AI and machine learning to help or to produce tools that help people in making complex decisions. And I think being able to pull all kinds of different data together to facilitate better decision making, I think is something that will transform a variety of different industry sectors, including in project management.
Matt, did you want to come in on that?
So many thoughts. Look, I think so. I suppose I should say at the outset, obviously there'll be a range of project management experiences on the call today. So, I'm coming mostly from a position of infrastructure and construction. So, let me just sort of say that up front. Look, I think that's exactly right, and there really is a lot of interesting tools that are being deployed now. I suppose the one thing I really tip my hat to, Stephanie, as you went along, which is, these sorts of tools looking like they are understanding what they're doing. We can, I'm sure, get into this as the conversation goes along. But the one thing I would note is that, the thing that excites me, Jennifer, is we really are at the very beginning. For all that's said and for all the incredible technology that's out there, and we will, I'm sure, go through a lot of it in the course of this conversation. The reality is that much of the industry is slowly working through implementation. We all probably on this call are in the hype cycle, the Gartner hype cycle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the industry is. And so that, looking at it one way, I think that provides an enormous opportunity for us as we sort of go forward in the sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had lots of conversations, Stefan and Matt, on also kind of the formats of data, and maybe we can come back to that and the kind of challenges that poses for AI. Disha, I wanted to just sort of bring you into the conversation and ask you, how AI, changes our understanding of project leadership. It's quite a big question, but I wonder if you could kind of talk to that.
Sure. As Matt said, I think we're at the beginning of this journey. And so far, when I look around, I don't see a big change in terms of people still talking about the project manager as the main source of leadership in projects. And the main conversation, there's been a recent paper in Harvard Business Review as well, is around replacing the managerial tasks so that the project manager has more time for leadership in terms of coaching, stakeholder management, which I think is only the tip of the iceberg. If we kind of look around what's happening, and I've been doing a bit of reading as well. For example, Kyoto University has lately been working on 20,000 scenarios for the future and trying to understand the divergence of when, the Japanese society will no longer be able to move towards sustainability. And I think it's those kind of cutting edge opportunities where kind of leadership can play a bigger role if we view leadership as, value creation and future making in those kind of terms, not just the control of projects. So I think and if you look at NASA, they've been doing quite a lot on this in this space as well, where I think offers opportunities for really extending our leadership acts to become more valuable and contribute to the value creation process. For example, they've delivered new designs that are lighter in a much faster speed. So I think, you know, it could really open up opportunities for productivity, and similar to what Stefan and Matt was saying in terms of optimizing supply chains. There are lots of examples out there, but I think we also need to be careful because leadership is always viewed as a neutral objective doing the best thing, and AI kind of is also viewed as that. It's got an aura of objectivity with that data. But, you know, as we've all kind of seen, and I was playing with ChatGPT last week where it said I've falsified all this information in the classroom to all my students, and everyone kind of looked. I think we need to be careful about that, as well as the ethical kind of issues that might arise from the biases that are reproduced from that data. And I guess lastly, I don't want to talk too long, but there is, I think, still that kind of view also out there that if roles kind of start getting replaced by AI, we're looking at followers who are AI, which means that it's no longer about charisma and motivation, that kind of stuff in our relationships, leadership relationships, but more about ethical and moral mentoring of those kind of AI followers. And I also want to pose the question, can AI be the leader if we're looking at leadership as an influence relationship, which is a conversation I don't think has started yet. And what does that mean?
Yeah, Dishla, I think you raised lots of interesting questions in that conversation, and I'm sure there are some questions that are posed that the audience might want to come back to on that as well. Matt, I can see you trying to get into the conversation here. Is there something you want to say to this?
So I was reading a look. I'll lay this and then I'll go into something else, which is I was reading an interesting article literally in the last couple of days that was talking about, you know, is AI the death of the PMO? You know, do you actually need, like, what does a PMO do? You know, it sort of collates information, looks for, you know, themes, you know, produces reports, you know, all the other things that PMOs do as well. But, you know, fundamentally, are those particular jobs even sort of required to have a PMO, and what does the sort of an AI do at that? But you know, the way I would kind of look at it is, I think, and you know, just to sort of toe the company line just for a moment, and you know, Bentley's view is, you know, engineers in particular are not going to be replaced by AI. There's always things that are going to sort of need humans, you know, and possibly by the time those are famous last words, you know, I'll be doing something else. But I think what AI does do is potentially moves that window of leadership kind of just a step further out. So, you know, if you know, 20 years ago, you were, you know, trying to draw up templates to collect data off disparate projects in the PMO, well, you know, probably 10 years ago, you kind of stopped doing that. You know, if what you're doing now is, you know, preparing board reports and looking at, you know, risk registers, you know, in 10 years' time, maybe you're doing something that's a slightly a further step back. And so I think that's sort of one way of looking at it. And I know that we'll get into sort of data issues in a moment, but the other point I wanted to make is, you know, there's 0% unemployment in construction, kind of effectively. Certainly in Australia, you know, there's 100,000 jobs in infrastructure that will literally never be filled. And so, you know, that comes back to, you know, in the context of AI, you know, in everything else that is, in everything else that we are doing, whether that's from driving a car to playing an Xbox to, you know, clearly using your phone, but, you know, to opening the fridge, you know, there is, you know, infrastructure intelligence, or should I say AI intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, behind that. And, you know, the project management profession and, you know, in my case, the infrastructure project management sector, you know, has a long way to go, I think, in terms of how it can look at, practical applications of AI. And again, I come back to, that means that there's lots of opportunity. That means there's lots of things to do. But in the same breath, we just, I think, need to be tempered in terms of what we're expecting, this year versus what, we could see in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about the hype cycle, Matt, and the kind of the short term, medium term, and long term. And often in universities we're playing in that medium term to long term space. And sometimes with these new technologies, because everyone's so busy talking about them, it can be hard to recognise that there's still a lot of need for research and development and build out of the technology. And Stefan, I wonder if you wanted to reflect on anything that's come up in the conversation already. I'm aware that we discussed some of these things in the kind of agendas over the last few days.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I think about in terms of AI and some of the tools that are being presented is that they are tools, and they can be used to enhance skill. So we've been working in mining automation, for example, for 15 or 20 years, and the conversation really started out as, well, how can we present data more effectively, in the mine environment to managers to help really manage these enormous projects. And you can look at it from an individual vehicle automation project all the way through to the full production process that goes into mining, and each part can be enhanced with the right tools. And early on, a lot of the work on sort of the AI and the sensing was to kind of aid operators in driving big trucks. If we'd sort of gone into that conversation saying, oh, we want automation and we'll build autonomous vehicles, that conversation would have stopped pretty quickly. But as you started to introduce these tools, then you start to realize that actually, the person, who's driving the truck is getting all this, their skill is increasing because they're presented with additional information. I think in this kind of project management space, you can imagine, people without experience of running these big projects being presented with more effective data and with more effective tools to help wade through what's happening across big programs, and having their kind of skill level increased as a consequence of being more aware of what's going on across some of these projects earlier on, maybe being able to flag those projects. And I guess I was just going to sort of reflect on the fact that today here in Australia, the government just announced they're cancelling 50 high-risk projects, with an anticipated saving of over $7 billion. And there's questions about, what was the merit of those projects, the strategy, the ability to deliver value from those projects. And I guess there's a question of, should they even have got to that point where now some years on, they're looking at making some savings. So helping people with the planning, the presentation, the preparation of projects, tracking those projects while they're underway. And then I think the sort of, I guess the debrief at the end, the reflection on what went wrong, what can we learn? I think there's a lot of data there that probably sits in reports and sits in project outcomes documents that isn't exploited then to kind of learn for the next big project, and to provide project leaders with better tools with which to kind of manage the next project. And each of those projects is going to have some unique aspect, but I think there are some fundamental things that carry across big projects.
There are, go on, Matt.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in and note a couple of things, which is one, I think it's interesting that you were talking about, reskilling or upskilling or, additional skilling the truck drivers, but, you can sort of put that across, most sites. And just to sort of note the point, and then we can sort of move on, but, there is a concern, that I don't agree with, but there is a concern that AI is going to kind of come for everyone's jobs, in particular in this space. And as I said, I think that I think we're far from that. But I think one thing it does do is it does actually open up, the sites, the roles, the jobs, to kind of the Xbox generation for want of a better term, you know, and allow people to sort of see those jobs as not necessarily, you know, well, those jobs that face the issues that jobs in our sectors sometimes do, without going through all the ins and outs. But I think that you know, it does allow people to sort of see those as more accessible roles, particularly if you've got you know, a base understanding of technology. But what I did want to actually jump on was Stefan's point around, you know, taking benefits from one project to the next, and this is where I can kind of very quickly jump on my soapbox for data governance in particular, which is, you know, we step back again to, you know, where are we in the process of developing and implementing, you know, AI and even machine learning, I should say, into the sector. And, you know, the fundamental point I would make is, you know, we still don't really have a full industry awareness or an acceptance of a data standard, data dictionary, you know, choose your term. And a really good example, and a really simple and accessible example that we came across was, you know, once you've handed over the site and you've got teams going back in, you know, looking at, in this case it was elevators, you know, are they undertaking an activity, a repair, an operation, or a maintenance? And you know, however you're classifying that has implications for, you know, where that particular work is slotted in the project management tool, and who's paying for it. And that's a very simple one, but I think it's a sort of illustrative, which is, you know, we're quite sort of far away from being able to pick up the learnings that you have in one project and just sort of moving across to others. Even when, and you know, I'm as guilty as the next person, when we are, you know, touting benefits from digital transformation of, you know, 20% cut in, you know, time and or costs, or, you know, whatever, choose your figure, there's a bunch out there. But actually a lot of that's dependent on being able to take those learnings that you've got in project 1 and flowing them through to project 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this conversation starts to get us into those portfolios of projects and how we manage at that level, you know, and understand futures, you know, as we're sort of planning projects. And I think that's a real challenge for governments, and maybe something we can come back to. I want to pick up some of the questions in the chat. Yeah, I still have lots of questions, but let me get into these questions. So Roger Swinburne is asking, I would be interested in understanding how AI may change the qualification of value in major project programs to a more systems and outcomes approach to business case and investment value. Yeah, hashtag ESG. I mean, Dishla, do you want to kind of comment on that? I mean, I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think, you know, what we said there about freeing up time to kind of focus on these kind of issues, it's kind of changing the leadership role a little bit. And I think it's turning it towards value creation in projects. And obviously, I think that needs to be reflected in the qualification as well. At the moment, our kind of project leadership training is very much about team leadership. You know, how do you motivate a team? How do you, you know, that's like the main kind of gist of it, and some visioning, but in terms of implementing a vision that's given to us. But as we move more and more towards uncertain kind of conditions, I think, you know, there's a bigger role to play in terms of value creation and kind of figuring out how that will work out as uncertainty unfolds during the project. And I think, yeah, there is a lot to do in terms of reorienting how we train our project managers or anyone else who might contribute to leadership in these major projects as well. In that
I mean,
space.
just before I move on to the next question, because, you know, we're very interested in the way that uncertainty arises and unfolds in projects. I mean, I wonder, you know, I wonder how much AI can help us here, because AI, you know, is kind of being trained on the data we've already got. And if we're wanting to move into new worlds, you know, it's kind of, someone told me that that it's the biggest plagiarizer, right? It kind of reflects the society you've got at the moment, not necessarily the society you want to move into. I don't know if you have a comment.
I was exactly thinking that as the conversation was unfolding. I think, especially learning from projects or learning within projects, if we're only looking at the past, I think we're kind of limiting ourselves. But I think AI also, as we've touched on earlier, has potential to look into the future. And I think those are also the capabilities we need to explore, so that we've also got some kind of scenarios, foresights, insights, and perhaps we can use that fast processing power to kind of work through alternative futures and help us guide, navigate that. So I definitely agree. I think a lot of the emphasis has been on the kind of past data, but I think we also need to think about how we connect that to potentialities in the future, and how we kind of create data around that potential data and guide people who are trying to, especially project managers who are leading this kind of navigation through uncertainty through that.
Yeah, I mean, the next question in a sense kind of connects to this, right? So will AI take over the world? It says, jokes aside, what are the ethical considerations of utilizing AI in the context you're discussing?
Why don't I jump in here, Jennifer? Because I think I don't want to sort of get too specific, but there is a difference when you're talking about different types of AI. And so if you're looking at an LLM versus a generative, they kind of respond different ways to inputs. But I was thinking about NPlan in the course of the conversation. The last answer, I mean, they, when looking at risks, they have an enormous risk library. They've got 740,000 projects, I think they've got now in their machine learning. But fundamentally, they are looking at what has happened before and trying to make assessments based on, parameters for data. And that is the same here when we're talking about, the ethical implications of AI, the ethical sort of dimensions of AI. It all comes back to an awareness of, how it's being fed. What data is it learning from? And an awareness of bias when looking at that data. If you're trying to ask the AI system to think about whether or not it should, what's that classic problem, for autonomous vehicles? Does it run over a crowd of kids or a grandparent in a wheelchair? I don't know how I would answer that, so I'm not really sure how I'm expecting an AI system to come up with the magic answer. And so I think when looking at it, an awareness of how it's being constructed, and by that I mean the data that's being fed, looking out for biases, but also again not expecting it to solve the truly moral problems of our time. It may get there, but again, I don't think we're there yet.
I think we have another couple of questions in the chat on this, and I'll kind of run through them and then maybe ask the panel to comment. And Stefan, I know this is an area that we sort of had some conversation around, how you rely on models, about it in the university. But let me run through these questions. So Ian Heppenstall is asking, how do we avoid the risk that AI, ML, LLM learn our bad habits and processes? One view is most of the existing data these models will learn from is based on poor or suboptimal practices. If that's what's learned and then automated, how do we avoid reporting the same wrong data and making the same wrong decisions just faster and with fewer people? And I think in a way, Chris Lawler's question is sort of similar to that. So she's asking, is Gen AI my polite intellectual conversation partner and collaborator, or am I conversing with a biased but clever mimic? Where are we at, and where are we going? Can it be the way that PPP manages to explore issues and opportunities? And I wonder, I I've kind of merged those two just because I think they're both dealing with related issues. I wonder if, you know, how do we avoid the risk that AI, ML, LLM learn from our bad habits and processes?
I mean, there's a lot of conversation about sort of trust, you know, and transparency in AI. How do we know how the decisions are being taken by these tools, and you know what's actually going in to train them? You know, those large language models are really just taking huge corpuses of text data and learning, you know, what order text typically comes in. And some of the early efforts at sort of deploying chat bots in the wild, you know, ended up with these things that were horribly misogynistic and learned terrible habits and kind of could be driven very quickly into some pretty bad places and were quickly shut down. You know, I think there's some safeguards that are now putting sort of guardrails that say, you know, these are not the sorts of things these tools should be espousing, and you know, there's some careful work goes into the data that's used to train them. I think in terms of the question about, you know, how do they avoid learning our bad habits, part of that is being able to classify when poor decisions have been made and sort of using that in the training to say, these are poor examples of decision-making processes where things have come out badly as distinct from good. And if you've got enough examples on both sides of the ledger, the idea, I guess, is that the machine learns to distinguish what is characteristic of the good projects as distinct from the ones that have maybe come off the rails.
I may just quickly add on to that. I think it's also, I totally agree with Stefan, but I want to add, it's also about reflecting on who defines that good and what that is, and that we kind of keep a trace of that and reflect and come back to that as we learn more about the world, because what we think is good might not necessarily be the case in the next situation. And I think it's that kind of continuous journey and just keeping that transparency of the choices we made in defining what we think is good, particularly in terms of leadership, is, I think, that kind of ethical duty of care that we need to kind of continue to have.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think also that a lot of the AI that we've got at the moment is really around schedule or cost, or, you know, around documents. And I wonder, you know, if maybe we could just come back to Chris Lawler's question of, you know, where are we at and where are we going? You know, can it be an opportunity for PP managers to explore issues and opportunities? You know, I think Roger's question right at the beginning was sort of getting at that too, when it was talking about ESG and you know, and I wonder, you know, if anyone's got any reflection on how AI might be used in that more exploratory way around some of these kind of more future these kind of emerging issues of sustainability or other things that PPP managers are faced with.
I think you know, let's be clear, one of the great things about AI is its ability to run scenarios. And I think that, you know, be it in, you know, project planning or risk identification or, you know, any of these other requirements that you know, require scenario operations, is really where AI can kind of step up and step in terms of project management. You know, however, and so what does that do? That in a situation where we can look at it here and predict, you know, that allows project managers to, again, you know, do that higher thinking, for want of a better term. Actually, that's probably not necessarily the way that I would phrase it, but, you know, different thinking in terms of the project. It allows for, you know, increased efficiency on projects, you know, doing more with certainly less people, which is, you know, always needed. But I think, you know, there are some aspects of projects, again, and, you know, I'm trying to sort of think beyond LLM applications to sort of, those wider AI applications, and be that in, sequencing and planning and project, some of those other ways that we're using it. You can't have a AI tool, and let's sort of pick on GPT because that's always fun. But you can't have GPT kind of hallucinating how a bridge is going to be project managed. And so, at this point in time, as we all know, these models do great things. They can be lots of fun, and they do provide a lot of increased efficiency. But certainly, from where we are now, and they will get better, and I understand that. But certainly from where we are now, you do need that human, final sort of set of eyes and really final brain on these sort of complex, decisions. Because I think to Stefan's point, which is having an understanding about what's under the hood is really hard. It's not really going to be the skill set of a project manager, I would imagine. And so, being able to keep an understanding and keep a tight leash on how you're deploying AI, I think is going to be kind of key for the next little while at least.
And I'd suggest that maybe we've been talking a lot about how AI might help people manage projects, but I think another thing to really think about is how project managers need to think about projects that are employing AI tools and sort of the decision making that's happening there and the responsibility and where that comes from. So they gave the example of managing the building of a bridge. It's entirely feasible that you might get your civil engineering team out there trying to optimize the design of the bridge, but then you need to really understand what the implications of the decision that's making. And I think having some fluency in AI, we've talked a little bit about the hype. It's very easy to say, oh, AI is going to solve all our problems. But I think really understanding what those tools can do, what they're capable of, what the limitations are, what the risks are, is important for project managers, business leaders to really understand. And so we've got some programs at the university, and there's many around the world, providing that kind of AI literacy so people can make informed decisions about the use of these tools and what impact they might have, and where the risks inherent in that might be, including bias and a lot of the other things we've talked about.
And just to bring that full circle, Stefan, as well, which is and you sort of see where that's needed when looking at, for example, the infrastructure pipeline that the ministers you mentioned earlier has reviewed and released that information today. More, I don't think I need to necessarily go through the ins and outs of this on a project management symposium. More time spent planning at the front means better understanding of costs later on, and deploying technology to enable that means more effective decisions at the back end and as you go along, and that's certainly something that I think Infrastructure Australia and other similar bodies is something has been sort of banging that drum for quite some time.
Can I pick up another couple of questions? So I mean, there's a comment in the chat, right, which is not really a question, and I think we've sort of covered it, which is that maybe AI can help with analysing possible scenario models, and I think we came on to that discussion. So, but then and actually, I think Ahmed Alfin Afwan is asking, do you think the utilisation of AI in project management will introduce new and unforeseen types of project risks? And I think we've had some discussion of that, but I don't know if there's anything anybody wants to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in, but I think as Stefan and Matt covered, that kind of links into AI literacy as well. I think, most of us lack that literacy. The technology is moving really fast. And obviously, unless you have a detailed understanding of it, it's a bit of a black box. And that by itself, I think, presents significant risks, especially in terms of assuming what this technology might do and relying, on it in that sense. So I think there is definitely something around just making sure we've got the right levels of AI literacy. And that doesn't have to be one person, that doesn't have to be necessarily the project manager. But within the team, that there is enough of that understanding and kind of reflecting on, I think that is required, because it might also bring other risks. If we think from a leadership perspective, motivation, if people think their jobs might go, there might be resistance to change. This is like any other transformation, depending on how fast you go. There might be other implications of, not everyone might view this positive, and therefore the other human behaviors might come into play that then people in leadership positions would need to cope with actively or proactively even.
Yeah, so we're sort of coming towards the end of the session, but Dijla, maybe I can just come back to you on one of the questions here. So what are the obstacles to achieving full implement? Oh, no, sorry, let me ask you this question. So how does adaptive project leadership evolve in the context of AI integration, considering the increasing complexities and technological advancements in modern projects?
Oh, that's a big question. I think AI offers the opportunity to navigate uncertainty a lot better if we are to capitalize on it. I don't think we're there yet. And I think this comes back to your comments earlier, Jennifer. I think our focus is a lot on management, which is around control, whereas leadership is a lot more about navigating uncertainty and kind of dealing with those things. So if we start bringing AI into the leadership space a lot more, I think, we need to think about how we can aid that navigation of uncertainty. And it might be scenarios, as we discussed earlier, but I think there's also a role there in terms of innovation, because AI can be powerful in generating new ideas in the early stages, the divergent kind of thinking space. So I think there are spaces where, and that's where I think that the adaptability of leadership comes in how to, navigate those spaces and how to ask the right questions and bring in AI in the right places to be able to then kind of find out novel solutions or alternative ways of moving forward that might be different from the past, as we talked earlier.
I think if there are any academics in the audience who are, working in this space that are kind of prompted by this, then we have a call for papers on project leadership in a changing world, and we'll put the link in chat later.
Yeah, and at the URAM conference, right? So please join us there as well, where we will be discussing about innovating project leadership. So I think that would be great as well.
Yeah. So Matt, Stefan, I don't know if you have any final comments, because I'm just about to kind of wrap up. So just some closing remarks.
Let me just jump in and say, look, I think let me answer the question that sort of skipped across the screen a moment ago, which is how do we get to full digital transformation? And look, it's both a need for people, and it's a need for understanding of the financial implications, and it's a need for utilizing tools like procurement processes, etc. But I guess those are all sort of one way of answering it, but fundamentally, I think it comes down to leadership, and it comes down to imagination. There's a lot to be gained from this, and study after study after study after study shows that there are benefits from it. And I suppose those of us that are in the space just need to sort of keep pushing and getting those doing the work to understand.
Thank you. Stefan.
And I might just close with a thought on semantics. And we've talked a lot about AI and machine learning kind of interchangeably, but I think they are two different things. And a lot of the tools that we're using and developing and seeing these days are really machine learning tools. They're large nonlinear function approximation systems that learn how to connect to a certain set of inputs and pattern recognize the pattern and predict what the output should be. think we're still a fair way from sort of the more, an idea of a generalized intelligence. So, I think we have to be a bit cognizant of some of the hype and the sort of bias that comes in with these tools. And, I think, as I said at the outset, I think they are tools. And I think if they're applied appropriately, they can do great things and be really a support. But we have to be careful about how we use them and conscious of their limitations.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting conversation, and I'm going to hand over now for the next session. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nada Nadapadjo, and thanks again to the panelists.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
It was a great discussion. I know some of you might need some time to reflect on all these great discussions about AI in project leadership. But we have 4 more presentations in this session. I would like to start with the acknowledgement of the country. I'm joining remotely from the land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation in the University of Sydney. We are in the land of the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. And I would like to also emphasize and extend it globally wherever you are joining, especially at the time that these issues are very important for us. So without further ado, I would like to start introducing our first presenter, Dr. Eleni Papadoni-Kolaki from Delft University of Technology, and she's talking about psychologically safe digitally enabled project teams. Eleni, back to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be part of this symposium, and I also enjoyed the conversations just now about AI. So my presentation, it's a bit on a similar topic, again, looking at digitally enabled project teams, but more from the side of leadership. How do we lead these teams, especially since digitalization is impacting the psychological safety of the members. I've worked on this with my colleague Beth Morgan, who couldn't join us today, and it's also an ongoing study. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts as well. The motivation was a lot of research that's around how digitalization is impacting people and project work. We know that there are some discussions about how the digital, it's not just the end goal, but it's also something that it's affecting the way that people interact, teams are managed, and how project managers, they are developing their delivering projects as well. And so amongst these changes and these shifts that take place in project teams, we were very interested to see about psychological safety and dive deeper into how the teams react to all these changes we just mentioned. So just to talk a bit about psychological safety, I'm sure many of you have already heard these terms before. They come from some decades ago, and the idea is that when we have a psychologically safe team, then the team members, they're more keen to take risks, to grow, to experiment with new technologies, and this can affect also growth, learning, and innovation in the teams itself. So it's we established from previous studies that it's worth shedding a bit more light, especially on psychological safety of project teams that undergo digitalization. Therefore, we sought out to answer the question how the leader's behavior can establish psychological safety in project teams that are impacted by digital transformation. And as I mentioned, this is an ongoing study. We focused a lot on qualitative methodology, and the setting was the built environment construction sector. We interviewed so far 14 industry experts, and we have already seen some saturation in the data that I'll present in the next slide. The people that we interviewed, they were people that had to fit on these two different topics. So one had to do with the digitalization aspect, and the other had to do with leadership, but also looking at health and safety in projects. But some of them were global health leaders. So they were people who were familiar with both the psychological safety topic, but also the digital transformation that it's undergoing in projects. And we are also looking at both junior and senior people. So most of them were leading their teams, but also we tried to get a more holistic representation of the sample by looking at people who are more at the junior side. And our next step after we finish analyzing this data would be to go into a focus group and try to test some of these ideas, but also co-create some solutions and recommendations with experts. So moving on, that's my last slide. These are the preliminary findings, and you can see some first, second order coding, as well as some clusters of themes that have emerged. So what we ended up from the first analysis that we did was essentially the role of leadership and how it's changing, and it has different impact areas, if you like, in order to support innovative and very collaborative project teams. One had to do with a more strategic positioning of the team within the parent company and the client regarding risks and costs and rewards, especially as concerns technology and implementation of the technology and how this is changing workflows and the workspace. And the other side was more at the individual and organizational level, if you like, with regards to how the team is organized and self-organized in order to create value through this innovative way of working. So we ended up looking at these two aspects, but also some emerging findings had to do with different patterns on the impact of psychological safety on people. So we either had people who were more reluctant, let's say, to take over the risk, and so psychological safety was poorer, if you like. But we also had individuals who were more keen to take the risks. So these types of individuals and the context of their teams is also interesting to look further. And just a final comment, as emerging finding, COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of that came a lot, emerged a lot, came a lot in our discussions with the interviewees, although we were not specifically talking to them or asking them about this challenge, and we weren't asking them especially about remote work through Teams and so on. But this was something that emerged in a lot of interviews. So I think it's worth a bit to look more about how the after effects of this pandemic also have impacted project work. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, happy to discuss with you.
Thanks, Eleni. So our presenters would stay here, and we would have a lot of time for discussions. Please post your question on the Q&A. I can see questions are starting to come up. So I would hand it over to Jens Hunhevich from ETH Zurich. He's representing his team, and he's presenting a different technology, which when we saw the discussions were going about technologies and the cycle of the technologies, we can see that this technology has had also its cycle, and he's presenting interesting implications of the crypto commons. So the floor is yours, Jens.
All right, hello from Switzerland to everyone. I'll present our work on decentralized project delivery on the crypto commons. As said, it's about blockchain, technology that had a bit of hype cycle, but we still think there's a lot of interesting implication to project delivery. So let's dive into it. see if I can control slides. All right. So the main question or main motivation we had is, can we further decentralize project delivery? And why is this question relevant? We think construction was described repeatedly as a complex system. If you look at this picture, even if you're not from construction, you can see there is a lot of interdependencies from different stakeholders, project teams. You're dependent on external factors like weather and traffic. So you have a lot of nonlinear and uncertain system dynamics in a construction project. And for complex systems, decentralized bottom-up coordination or self-organization is suggested to be the main governance system. And this insight comes from studies from nature, like bees and ants, but also from man-made systems like traffic control or wind turbine optimization, where these approaches actually prove to be very successful. And interesting is also that project deliveries, collaborative project deliveries like IPD that start to use more decentralized approaches like shared stewardship of project resources, they're actually very successful. So our question is, can we go further along these lines and more decentralized, more project delivery? And of course, we look towards technology as a means to achieve this. And the main technology we are looking into is blockchain. So I want to bring you now the concepts a bit closer, why we think this is the case. So the first concept you need to understand is common pool resource theory. A common pool resource is a resource that is open to all, so everyone can go and use this resource. And what usually happens is the tragedy of the commons. For example, in pastures where everyone can bring their cows to graze, you want to reap the benefits to yourself, and you deplete the resource over time. Now, one suited governance system for that is bottom-up coordination. And Elinor Ostrom introduced 8 Ostrom principles that she found through case study research, how these common pool resource scenarios can be managed. The interesting connection with construction is that also IPD or like collaborative project delivery resembles some of these Ostrom principles in their governance structure. One example is that they pool together resources and put alliance contracts for shared risk rewards in place. So participants are incentivized to more collaborate during the time of the project instead of using as many resources as they can for themselves. So the connection with blockchain that is interesting is that also blockchain can be seen as a common pool resource scenario. They share similarities with free and open source software like Wikipedia, where you also have a lot of free rider problems. For example, everyone wants to read the articles, but no one wants to write them. And blockchains are very expensive systems to put in place. They need to run a lot of computers, and you need to participate in consensus algorithms to add new transactions to the system so the overall system works. And the interesting thing is how blockchain solves this free rider problem or this common pool tragedy of the commons problem. And it's all about crypto economics. So now we need to dive a bit into what blockchain can do. And I don't have time to go into too much detail, but 2 main concepts are smart contracts, which can encode logic, how to interact with transactions. And you can code new tokens, which are basically, you can create money. So you can create value containers and give them certain features. And blockchain use this to incentivize contribution to the public good. And this is called the crypto commons. So if you behave with the system and you contribute, you earn cryptocurrency, and you are incentivized to actually contribute. So the idea is to use these mechanisms also for other cases, and in our case, project delivery. So we had to, what do we have to do to find out how we can use this for project delivery? And we dove into literature. I mean, you cannot really read this. That's okay. I'll just give you an idea what this means. So we identified 14 mechanisms in line with these Ostrom principles that blockchain can do, and then identified applications to project delivery. So one key concept, for example, is identity. So you need to be able to identify participants, are they human or machine, in the system, so you can actually track what they're doing. One other concept, for example, is the tokenization of resources. So you can create resource pools through tokenization. It can be money, it can be time, it could be also physical resource representation. And with both these features in place, you can have very transparent monitoring of and fast reactions to what's happening in the system, something that is really important for self-organization or bottom-up coordination. And blockchain is a very transparent system. Everyone can see these transactions. So it's a very well-suited system for that. And finally, you can then create a lot of coordination mechanisms that interact with these other features. So you can say who can access the project resources under what conditions, who can participate and how in the decision making, like sanctions if you don't participate as needed in the project, or also dispute resolution mechanisms. And a lot of these features were already proposed by research from different individual research efforts. And what we did, we basically created this overarching conceptualization and system perspective, how they could work together to create a new system. And this can scale from like individual applications of blockchain, for example, for tendering, towards whole decentralized systems. And then you have a lot of these interactions between different applications. So overall, what we propose is a new system perspective, using this technology to scale project delivery as a common pool resource scenario. And it potentially is an alternative vision how to scale project delivery, how to adapt to more complex systems or complex projects, instead of going the opposite direction, which we also see a lot today, trying to simplify the system, the supply chain, and integrate the supply chain. So it's, in our opinion, a different vision how to go about the future of project delivery. I leave it here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sure we can have we can discuss questions. These are the resources that are published for now, if you're interested to read more. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. I just want to emphasize, if there is any question, please, I can see the questions are coming, but please don't hesitate to post it there. I can see some of our presenters actively are engaging with the question, but we would also have time at the end to discuss them. So I'm going to introduce our next presenter from home, from Sydney. So Ken is presenting his team, and he's talking about community stakeholder engagement on social media. Ken, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nader, and greetings everyone from all across the different continents. So my topic is on response strategies for community engagement, stakeholder engagement on social media. This is work that I'm doing together with Professor Pernille Eskerod and Associate Professor Anna Lund Jepsen, as well as Ivy Tang, who's is in the audience, and she's my PhD student. And this research is also funded by the Project Management Institute grant. So we began our original research question with this: how do projects engage stakeholders on social media? And the idea was that, you know, when we looked at the preliminary data, what we found was that actually on social media, it's actually very difficult to identify who the actual stakeholders are. Although they might be active, we don't have much information about actually who's behind those accounts, be it on Twitter or be it on Facebook. We may have, for the more prominent leaders like news media or political leaders and so on, but not for every community stakeholder. And so that posed a challenge. So when we talk about traditional project stakeholder analysis in the offline world, we are presented with the framework from Eskerod on identification, assessment, and prioritization. And this is not new at all. So identification is really about identifying who can be affected or who is affected by the project. And assessment is about understanding the motivations of every stakeholder, using that information to understand where they can contribute, how much they can contribute, and so on. And prioritization is really about focusing on the most urgent stakeholders, or in the words of Mitchell and colleagues, on the most definitive stakeholders who have urgency, legitimacy, and power as well. So we found that this was actually slightly problematic and very challenging in the online world. It's not necessarily quite easy to do this. And so we adjusted our question, and the question became, what refinements or adjustments to project assessment and response strategies are advisable if the project aspires to engage community stakeholders via social media? And it's also very timely that for the purpose of finding an answer to this question, we contextualized it within the domain of the Western Sydney International Airport, which is the second international airport being built in Sydney here in Australia. Is due for completion in 2026, and this has been on and on with the community and the government, local, federal levels since the 1990s. So it's been a long time coming, and it's finally coming to fruition. And it's very, very exciting to be right at the heart of this construction project, because we also believe that this is part of history, particularly in Australia. We looked at a number of themes that were ongoing in the social media space, and we found that there were things about land issues. There were things, there were chatter about flight paths, the naming of the airport. But the two themes or the two embedded cases that we found most prominent for us was the experience center, which is a physical center that showcased the airport and showcased the construction of the site. And the other theme was local employment. And these garnered most user engagement in the online space, with the project responding to it as well. And the platform of choice was Facebook, purely because of the accessibility of the data, as well as the fact that there was a lot of engagement between stakeholders and the project as well. And so our unit of analysis was all the posts, the replies that were made, the emoticons that were tagged to the post, and so on. And the framework for our analysis, we looked at a couple of things. Number one, we looked at whether the comments from stakeholders were they positive, neutral, or negative towards the project. We also looked at the emotions they express, a capitalization of words, emoticons such as anger and happy faces that were tagged onto messages, and so on. The next thing we also looked at was the Johnston and Taylor's framework for stakeholder engagement, which was classified as high, middle, or low. Low is simply if you're liking a post, and high if you're really colluding together to basically oppose the project, and there's some impact happening, like a strike or something. And finally, using Alternate and Simonen's framework on response strategies, we also use that to understand what the response from the project was. So the findings that we found was that, number one, there was a high to medium level of engagement from the stakeholders. Now, these were obviously, they were opposing or neutral. At the same time, there were ones that were supporting as well. And so with the ones that were opposing, a lot of people criticized about the project process and outcomes and the side effects as well. And the ones who supported were very happy, for example, positive about employment opportunities and so on. What we found from the project response perspective was that there was often no response or no reaction or no acknowledgement to these stakeholder comments. And in terms of the strategy, it was generally mostly dismissal, which is ignoring the messages, or avoidance, which is basically pointing the finger to someone else to answer difficult questions like flight paths and so on. And so to conclude it all, what we're proposing is that as an adjustment for the social media context, because it's fairly difficult to identify stakeholders, attention is better focused on identifying those issues or the concern and so on. And from this case study, we say that when you identify those prominent issues, you can then also highlight those stakeholders who generally are very active about those issues. Once you have that, you can then categorize the issues, and then you can start prioritizing them. And finally, the acknowledgement of positive responses, encouraging that's important, as well as acknowledging their issues or their concerns or fears that they have. That's equally important as well. And having that kind of response ready to be deployed, particularly for issues that are very, very prominent at any point in time. So this particular article is published in August in the International Journal of Project Management. And I think Elahi has finally posted up on the chat for us. So please do have a read, and we can have more views in the article. So I really appreciate that. So with that, Nada, I will conclude my brief talk here, and I'll hand over to the next person. I'll hand back to you, Nada. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Very interesting discussion, similar to our previous presenters. So I would just, I wouldn't waste time, and I would hand it over to Xinyu, who is from Tongji University, and she's presenting an international team. I'm very interested in the depth of the data that you have collected. So she's talking about the transition to operation in large inter-organizational projects. So looking forward to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nada. Hi, nice to meet you. I am Xinyu Zhang, and I'm very delighted to be here to share our latest paper titled Designing the Transition to Operations in Large Inter-Organizational Projects, Strategy, Structure, Process, and People, published in the Journal of Operations Management. And we know large infrastructure systems can be divided into two categories, projects and operations. The activities and objectives of the project and the operations are inherently different. And due to the unique and one-time nature of projects, their organizational forms tend to be more temporary, goal-oriented, and evolving. In contrast, operations are more repetitive, and their organizational forms are more permanent, routine, and ongoing. Transition is where the two worlds of projects and operations collide, and where the two forms of organization coexist. Managers face significant challenges to reconcile the tensions between organizations with distinct logics, build versus use, and effectively manage the transition of the infrastructure asset from projects to operations. So we have the research question, how to organize the transition to operations in large inter-organizational projects. In the paper, we provided a comprehensive summary of the literature on projects, transitions, and operations, covering the organizational design aspects in terms of strategy, structure, process, and people. In this study, we conducted a longitudinal case study of Beijing Daxing International Airport, and it's the largest transportation hub in China to date. And our paper presents the organizational structure of Daxing Airport throughout its planning, construction, transition, and operational phases, offering valuable insights into how large projects are organized in China today. In the data collection, we conducted a 17-month participant observation. We have 2 rounds of interviews, and we have collected a substantial amount of data. We use GILE method to analyze the data. In the findings, we developed an organizational design framework for transitioning large inter-organizational projects to operations. We found that building connections and achieving continuity between projects and operations is the essence of organizational design strategies for large project transitions. And internalizing project and operational functions within the owner is a key approach to realize this objective. These strategies are achieved through relevant organizational design considerations regarding structure, process, and people. In terms of structure, we emphasize the evolution of organizational structures related to system integration. We emphasize forming ad hoc integrated organizations to address the complexity of the system. And in terms of process, we emphasize process extension and coordination mechanisms so that the project and operations systems overlap and promotes a smoother transition. In terms of people, we emphasize the concurrent leadership and job rotation between temporary organizations and permanent organizations. Temporary organizations here, for example, project management organizations, project delivery team, and permanent organizations, for example, government, owner, and operations management organizations. For practitioners, this framework can provide a holistic guide for future organizational design of large project transitions. And these findings can also be considered as optional organizational design building blocks. And in discussion, we have some interesting observations. We have some insights into the strong owner concept. And we have some insights into process mechanisms. Here, somebody may know Jennifer White made an insightful analogy of transition between projects and operations as passing the baton, emphasizing the coordination of the transition process. We further suggest the analogy of a three-legged race to frame the transition to operations of Daxing Airport, as requirements from project and operations should be considered together throughout the life cycle. And we have some interesting discussion of the concurrent and rotational roles. And we talk about the contingency issues. We discuss the possibilities and the limitations of generalizing our findings to other types of projects and different institutional contexts. And finally, to takeaways, the transition should be designed to achieve continuity between projects and operations, emphasizing coordination, information exchange, and reconciling temporary and permanent organizational forms. Ad hoc integrated organizations should be designed to manage transitions, emphasizing concurrent leadership and job rotation in temporary and permanent organizations. That's all my presentation. And welcome to download and read our paper. And finally, by the way, this is my first invitation to give a talk, so I'm very, very excited. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. Thank you, Nada.
Thanks, Xinyu. Great to hear about your work. So now we have all of our presenters, except Eleni, who excused because she had another engagement to leave, to answer your questions. I saw that before going to the questions, I just want to also point that you can see the questions that have been answered, and Eleni had very interesting discussions about the methodology and how they have collected the data and how this data has differentiated between the, for example, impact on digitization and the underlying impacts on the project itself. So you can read those discussions there. But for the presenters who are here, I would go first to Jens. And there is a very general question by Jean Laval Chou, which is about, is crypto a mature enough technology for project management use? I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, even though it's not specifically about your presentation.
Yes, I think it's one of the most relevant questions. And the answer is it depends, of course, right? So I don't know how much time we have to go into the details here, but I think certain applications are quite mature. I mean, the question is, are these the relevant applications for project delivery? So I think more simple use of blockchain for use of cryptocurrency, for example, maybe some more simple smart contract logic, I think could be applied. But in general, I think there is still a long way to go for the technology. We are very early stage still. The technology is very young. It's way younger than AI. And also there we are still at the beginning, as we heard in the introduction panel session. So I do think there is a lot to come. These technologies will improve. They will get cheaper. They will get more reliable. But I do think, yeah, to some extent, certain early applications could be also tested and implemented. But yeah, we need more research. That's why I'm doing this.
Thanks, Jens. I go next for the next question. I go to you, Ken. And there is a question about if there was any finding regarding the effectiveness and best practice methodologies for each of the social media platforms.
Yeah, thanks, Nader. Yes, so thank you for the question as well. In this particular study that we did, we actually firstly looked at a number of platforms. I think obviously one of them was Twitter, and we also looked at Instagram. We also looked at LinkedIn. I mean, all these different platforms have slightly different purposes, if you like. But the thing was, we focused more on Facebook purely because of the richness and the quantity of the exchanges that happened in these platforms. And unfortunately, we were not able to do a cross-platform analysis. Our focus was more on the engagement part between stakeholders themselves and the community stakeholders and the project. And so I think that is probably one of the limitations of the study, and that's, I think, has been touched on as well, to compare different, social media platforms. But having said that, what we have proposed in the conclusion is that the strategy that projects we believe should be adopting is obviously not going to be tied to a specific social media platform. As you can see, the strategy that's being provided is fairly generic, and it's not specific to any particular platforms. And as we know, with technology, they are, always changing as well. How Twitter has now become X, and there's, I think, Blue Sky that's coming out as well by the original Twitter founder. So hopefully that answers a question. Hopefully, a future study would do that, and we can then advise. Yep, for X, this is the sort of strategy you should be using. For Instagram users, this is the engagement strategy you should be using. I can definitely say I'm learning a lot from my teenagers in terms of how to engage on social media, because they are on a totally different platform. They're on Snapchat and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. Just before going to Shinyo, I just want to have a follow-up, maybe conversation. Do you think in future we would have an opportunity to connect these characteristics and strategies to certain type of algorithm behind these platforms?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nader, actually, this is a great segue as well from the previous talk on AI that we've just had. I mean, you can imagine, if we can train, the technology to be able to respond based on the patterns that we've had in the past before, or on the other hand, you could potentially have AI doing the entire analysis for you in terms of what are the current issues, and prioritizing that for you. That's a potential. I mean, that is definitely possible in my point of view, and I think that's where it might be heading as well. And we don't know. Maybe it could be AI engaging with AI on the other hand. So it is a very interesting time, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. Shinyo, I want to come to you. There is a question about the assumption of temporary organizing, and I just want to see how you want to unpack this assumption and how you have faced it in your research.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nada. I know there is a debate in the academy about this, the temporary versus permanent, and we use the temporary to describe the project. We use a one-time, unique, this such wording, but I know this, and in our paper we use the wording more temporary, not the temporary, and that's the first point. And the second, actually in our paper we have discussed the characteristics of repetitive of projects. Yeah, and because our research object is airports, it's the infrastructure, and such projects, such large infrastructure projects, actually they have the characteristics of repetitive, and because of this kind of repetitive, and the owner they have built and operated lots of airports, maybe subways, and so that they can have the in-house project capabilities. And so because of this kind of repetitive, and they can use their experience and or knowledge from these projects to next projects. Do you know Andrew Davis' paper? He talked about the repetition of economics of the projects. Yeah, we talk about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Xinyu. Coming back to you, Jens, there is a problematization question, and the question is saying, what was the problem with the way it was done, but with the old-fashioned currency on the project? And I would probably focus on that first, and then I would go for the follow-up question.
Well, this depends a bit. I think in certain projects it works quite well, and there seems to be not too much issue around payments. But there is also a lot of literature that describes a lot of problems around payments, late payments, insolvency of firms. I mean, I think there is problems, but I think in our work we don't only focus on what's wrong and how we can solve it with blockchain. I think it goes a bit further than that. It goes a bit towards what can we do new with this technology. And instead of just automating the existing processes, for example, how it's done nowadays, we can add a lot of new things. For example, instead of having just monetary pools, we can also code new asset classes. For example, we can tokenize the physical resource and make a resource pool out of that. We can tokenize time and we can make that a resource. And you can, instead of having just one dimension to optimize the project, which is money, you suddenly have maybe multiple options. And you can also create economic systems around these. And the second aspect I want to highlight is the aspect of machine participation, which is very interesting regarding the first panel discussion. Blockchain addresses can be controlled also by machines. The system doesn't involve any humans, it's technical systems. So as long as the transaction is valid in terms of the system requirements, it can be done. So you can start imagining AI agents that own addresses to get rewarded for project contributors. You can contributions like generative design agents, for example, also a lot of other things we talked about. And we also talked about the transparency, right? I think having governance done through blockchain creates a lot of transparency, especially if you start to deal with non-human actors that interact with the economic system of the project. So I think that's actually the more exciting part than just improving the old system a little bit. I think it brings a lot of new things to the table.
And these opportunities might also couple with other technologies. This is what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thanks, Jens. Coming back to you, Ken, there is a question about how do we identify stakeholders who are impacted by the project but are not active in the social media, especially for projects such as Western Sydney Airport, which is a legacy project?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good question, and obviously a very valid question as well. We have, for example, a number of different generations, for example, of community stakeholders who may not be active on social media, but they are living in those affected areas, for instance, and therefore, again, this would be just one side of the story in terms of what I presented in terms of the engagement online. The moment you talk about these stakeholders, our study would have, not much to say because we obviously have not studied them. We only could study the ones who are active on Facebook and so on. So I think that's why it's important for this sort of triangulation to occur. And that's why not just looking at social media aspects, but you need to also be able to look at those community stakeholders who are not necessarily engaging online. And this means doing everything, within the power of, for example, not just the local governments, but in terms from the project perspective, I think they basically have to reach out to as many avenues as possible. One of the things that community stakeholders do not differentiate is the government and us. If it's a project that's such as big as the Western Sydney International Airport, they wouldn't have necessarily information that, oh, if I have concerns, then I would have to go to the Western Sydney International Airport website, or there's a spokesperson there. They would naturally sometimes directly go to council and so on. And so in terms of identifying these pockets of stakeholders, I think it is important for the project, obviously, to consider reaching out to councils, making sure that there's good information and awareness that's being spread around, and considering also the cultural and linguistic diverse nature of these stakeholders, to make sure, because indeed a lot of the residents who live in Western Sydney, for example, in Cumberland Council, which is one of the councils that's affected, it has the highest number of refugees residents, for example. And so ensuring that these segments of the stakeholders are also included, I think this is also really, really important. They've done a really good job. For example, they have a flight path tool at the moment where you can definitely look at where the planes will fly over and whether your suburb or your residents would be affected or not. But from the project perspective, you will find that they haven't been really good, for example, in making sure that everyone's aware about this and bringing them along. And a lot of the times, in fact, I think Nena was, I think, asked the question, has advised me that people generally find out things from the news, including people from the council and so on. And so I think, doing as much as possible to, identify these stakeholders at all levels is absolutely crucial. But it's not the study that I've presented on today. The study hasn't looked at it. Yeah.
And would you probably add a little bit? So if we are adding more platform, basically we would try to find those missing spots as well. I'm assuming, for example, the tool you're mentioning might engage different stakeholders than the Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, what we have done is we've just looked at Facebook at the moment, just because of the sheer amount of interactiveness and the engagement and the replies and so on that's available there for us to study. What we've proposed is these are some guiding principles, if you like, in terms of response strategies. And because it's challenging to really identify stakeholders online, we found that they are more vocal around certain issues. And from the project perspective, those issues are worth listening to because these are not necessarily found in town hall meetings. they're not necessarily found on the Western Sydney International Airport. They have a regular official forum where council representatives are there, but not necessarily, inclusive of community residents, for example. And so that's quite important to consider that. And yeah, so that's, I think, how I would answer that matter.
Thanks, Ken. Coming to you, Xin Yu, there is the previous question was about discontinuity and temporary nature, and here we are talking about continuity. So how the project and organization can create continuity in the transition, and specifically they are asking if there was examples of these, what was continuous and what changed in the handover in the case study that you had.
It's a very good question, because in our paper, we always emphasize that we need to establish the continuity and connections between projects and operations in the transition. And we know in the traditional practice, in the transition, facilities are handed over, project-based organizations leave, and the delivery team is disbanded, and then operations organizations take over. This way create organizational separation and the disconnect between projects and operations. And we have our argument that transition is a phase that unfolds over time, involving the joining and the leaving of organizations, people, and the knowledge. So your question, what's the continuous, how can create continuity? In our paper, I think maybe from the process and people, in terms of process, we emphasized that the project management organizations are extended to the operations phase, and the operations management organizations can be extended to the project phase, so they can have an overlap, and it can create continuity. And also the people. In our paper, we highlighted the concurrent leadership. Do you know this? It means the leaders, they have both positions in the project management organizations and operations management organizations, because it's the same person. So he or she can use his capabilities to build this kind of continuity. And as for what changed in the handover, we know the objectives and the actives of the projects and the operations are inherently different. So the organizational structure is changed. And actually, I just think the organizational structure is changed, and everything can be continued and connected if you use some techniques or some considerations in our paper. It can be continued and connected. Thank you.
Thanks, Xingyi. So the main source of, if I understood right, you are mentioning that the main source of continuity was through people within the organization.
Actually, the strategy, people, structure, process, all these four aspects are continuous and connected in our paper.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Jens, there is a question about AI. Is AI wired up to act in good faith, tell the truth, be collaborative within the projects?
I think it's an interesting question. I think, first of all, I'm not an AI expert. I'm just loosely following what's going on with AI. I think I can more speak to how I think it connects to the research I do. And I think, in my opinion, especially in project-based settings that are like traditional project-based settings, collaboration is really important. And AI as a technology is kind of neutral. I don't think there is like any will to collaborate or not. It's a bit dependent how we integrate it into our systems. And there, I think the systems I imagine with blockchain as a baseline for more transparency can really help, because like connecting AI or forcing AI to interact with these systems gives also some transparency, right? So we can see what are the baselines or the decisions we use from AI and how we act on it, right? And the second part that is quite important, I think it's also about incentives. So I'm not too sure how an AI would react to incentives, but with humans, these incentives tend to be quite strong. So if you set up the incentives inside a project towards collaboration, you have a high likelihood that you're also moving that direction. And I do think that could be also true for AI. How that would exactly look like, I'm not sure, but that would be a very interesting new research field too, I think.
That can connect to your technology as well. Thanks for taking the question, even though it's not directly on your area. I come to you, Ken, with a quick question. How did you deal with any ethical issues about using the data?
Yeah, talking about ethics, the ethics application was the way for us to do it, although this was public data. But we still went in and put ahead a human ethics application at the university, and we have it approved. I should also mention that Facebook actually has the Open Research and Transparency platform, which allows us to actually use and publish the data. So it allows that, yeah, and that has been really helpful. But if you talk about the privacy of individuals and so on, we did mention that we were not so interested in what actually the one particular individual said. We're more interested in the patterns of the engagement, and we're more interested in if they were community members talking about things like flight path, for instance, what was the response strategy like, and was that negative or positive? So we're more looking at these sort of general patterns rather than zooming into one particular user group, for example, and that wasn't our intent in this study. And so we've where we had to show examples, for example, obviously we adhere to all the confidentiality and privacy aspects, and we de-identified the users and so on. We anonymized it in the presentation of our data. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. It's a very interesting way of ethics when we are having also social media. And the last question also because of the time, we only have 3 minutes left, is to you, Xinyu, and it is about how do we generalize especially the organizational design framework that you would have in other cases of mega projects.
In other institutional contexts, right?
Yeah.
Okay, actually this content is extensively discussed in our paper. So let me briefly explain. Globally, we know due to the significant impact of the large infrastructure projects, most of these projects are financed by governments, right? And so there are certain similarities in organizational configurations. And in China, what's the difference? The majority of participants in infrastructure projects are state-owned enterprises, and all participants are under the rule of administration power, right? And the issue of what we think the difference is the issue of system integration. In Daxing Airport case, maybe more about allocating resources under administrative power to meet changing tasks. And in contrast to the cases from other institutional contexts, maybe more about coordination of more independent economic entities, right? And to align the different interests. So the mechanism of the integration are different. In China, maybe by administration power, and in other institutional contexts, maybe by the market logic. Yeah, that's the answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Xinyu, and thanks to all of our presenters, including Eleni, Jens, Ken, and Xinyu, for very interesting research and also for your interesting answers to the questions that are raised. Also, I would like to thank all the audiences for being engaged in the discussion and asking interesting questions. Again, feel free to reach out to the presenters for following the question. With that, I would hand it over to Professor Jennifer White for the closing comments and the best of all.
Thanks, Nada. I can't put my video back on, so I hope someone will put me onto the screen. Yeah, so it just falls to me to identify and share with you a few opportunities to connect with us, and I'm hoping that someone will put up some slides. If not, I can do that. Yeah. So if you're a practitioner on the call, then and if you're an academic as well, then there are opportunities to connect with us through our mailing list and to follow us on social media. But I also want to flag some particular opportunities for our international academic colleagues. If we could move on to the next slide. Yeah, so we have this call for papers for a collection on project leadership in a changing world. So if you're working in this area, please do submit to that. And if you have problems with the deadline, please drop me an email. We also have a session on innovating project leadership at one of the major international conferences next year, and Dishla mentioned this in the first session at URAM, which is happening in Bath in 2024. And the deadline for that is early January. We have a couple of vacancies for people who are looking for their next academic role, both in the institute itself and also within the school, for multiple continuing positions in the school. And so then it really just falls to me to say thank you to our speakers, our panelists and presenters today and in the previous session, and to those people who chaired the sessions, and particularly to Aaron and the doctoral students who've been behind the scenes, with helping manage the chat, doing the social media, managing the slide decks and so on. We plan to have a symposium again this time next year. So we think this is a series that we would like to run, and we're reaching out to some of our international colleagues to co-chair and co-host these sessions next year. The tentative dates are the 7th and 14th of November, and we will just check that we're not clashing with any of the other major activities that go on in the year. But this seems to be a slot that is good for teaching schedules, but also it's a nice time to reconnect with some colleagues internationally that I can see on the line that I've met at conferences in the European summer, and it's now nice to connect and to see what people are doing and to have this conversation at this point in the year. So we plan to continue this. We're very happy to get your feedback and thoughts on what's worked and what hasn't worked and what you would like to see more of next year. But we hope that you will join us again in 2024. So thank you very much.